The story of King Solomon begins impressively. After the death of David, the great king of Israel, who had consolidated the kingdom and led the people with courage and faith, the responsibility of governing the vast and prosperous kingdom fell on the shoulders of his son, Solomon. He was not David's firstborn, but was chosen by God to succeed him. Solomon had big shoes to fill. After all, his father was not only a war hero, but also a man after God's own heart. At the beginning of his reign, Solomon was young, perhaps inexperienced, but there was something very special about him. He knew that alone he would not be able to govern a people as numerous and diverse as Israel. It was then that, in a gesture of humility and wisdom, Solomon sought divine guidance. One night, God appeared to him in a dream and made him an extraordinary offer. "Ask of me whatever you want, and I will give it to you." Imagine for a moment what this offer means. Solomon could have asked for anything: untold riches, an invincible army, a long life full of achievements. But instead of choosing these things, Solomon asked for something much more valuable. He asked for wisdom. He asked for the ability to discern between good and evil, so that he could govern the people of Israel with justice and righteousness. This request not only surprised, but deeply pleased God, and in response, God not only gave Solomon the wisdom he had asked for, but also granted him riches, honor, and lasting peace that would spread throughout his reign. From that moment on, Solomon became the wisest king who ever lived. His fame quickly spread to distant lands. Rulers, sages, and common people from all nations came from far and wide just to hear his words of wisdom. He was capable of resolving the most complicated dilemmas with a clarity and justice that impressed everyone. The people of Israel prospered like never before. Solomon took intelligent steps to ensure peace in his kingdom, making alliances with neighboring nations and strengthening the economy. Trade flourished, bringing wealth to Jerusalem. The city streets were full of life, with merchants, artisans, and people from all over, creating a vibrant multicultural center. Under Solomon's reign, Israel entered a golden age. Never before had the kingdom experienced such peace and prosperity. There were no wars, and the people lived in security, enjoying the fruits of the work of their parents and grandparents. Harvests were plentiful, trade flowed, and the kingdom was united under the leadership of a king who ruled with wisdom and the fear of God. This phase of Solomon's reign symbolizes not only a time of riches and splendor, but also a period of profound spiritual growth. Solomon built the great temple of Jerusalem, a work that his father David had dreamed of, but which he had the honor of carrying out. This temple was not just an impressive physical structure, but the symbol of the unique relationship between God and the people of Israel. The story begins with David's burning desire to build a house for the Lord. During David's reign, the Ark of the Covenant, which represented the presence of God, remained in a tent. David wanted to build a temple to honor God, but the Lord told David that this task would be his son's. And so, when Solomon came to the throne, he knew that this was one of his most important missions. Construction of the temple began in the 4th year of Solomon's reign and took 7 years to complete. And from the beginning, Solomon spared no effort to ensure that everything was done with excellence. He mobilized a vast army of workers, around 150,000 men, including bricklayers, carpenters, and artisans, to work on the project. Solomon also entered into agreements with King Hiram of Tyre, a neighboring nation, to provide the best materials possible. Cedars and cypresses from Lebanon, precision-cut stones, and pure gold were brought to Jerusalem. The temple itself was of indescribable beauty and grandeur, about 30 meters long, 10 meters wide, and 15 meters high. Its walls were covered in carved cedar and decorated with gold. The floors, altars, and utensils of the temple were also made of gold, symbolizing the purity and glory of God. Additionally, the fine linen hangings and bronze ornaments added magnificent details. The Holy of Holies, the holiest part of the temple, was the place where the Ark of the Covenant was placed. Only the high priest could enter there once a year to intercede for the people. The construction of the temple was not just a physical work, but also a deeply spiritual event. When the day of dedication arrived, Solomon gathered the entire nation of Israel for a great celebration. He offered thousands of sacrifices and, in a long prayer, begged God to always be present in that place and to hear the prayers of his people. It was a solemn and sacred moment. And then something extraordinary happened. The glory of God filled the temple. A cloud descended, and the presence of the Lord was manifested in such a way that the priests could not even enter to minister. It was as if God was saying, "I am here among you." The temple became the center of Israel's spiritual life. Every year, the people gathered to worship and offer sacrifices. It was the place where they sought forgiveness and communion with God. The Temple of Jerusalem consolidated not only the spiritual power, but also the political power of Solomon's kingdom. It represented the special covenant between God and Israel, a relationship based on fidelity and obedience to divine law. But the temple also represented something even greater. It was a glimpse of a future promise, when God's presence would not be confined to one place, but would dwell in the heart of every person who sought him with all their heart. Although this physical temple was destroyed centuries later, its importance and spiritual significance remain alive today. The construction of the temple in Jerusalem was a milestone not only in the history of Israel, but in the history of faith. It was a meeting place between heaven and earth, where God's people could come closer to him. For Solomon, it was one of his greatest achievements as king. The temple reflected God's glory, wisdom, and blessing upon Israel, establishing Jerusalem as the holy city and spiritual center for the world. One of Solomon's most intriguing strategies was his policy of alliances through marriage. Solomon, in addition to being famous for his wisdom and the construction of the great temple, was also an extremely skilled king in maintaining peace and stability in his kingdom. One of the most intelligent and effective ways he used to achieve this was diplomatic marriage. Throughout his reign, Solomon married several women from different nations, and these marriages were not just about love or family. They were political strategies that ensured Israel's security and prosperity. At that time, the kingdoms around Israel were always in search of power and territories. There were constant conflicts and disputes. To maintain peace and avoid unnecessary wars, Solomon knew he needed to build strong alliances with these neighboring nations. And instead of using military force to do so, he opted for a more diplomatic approach: weddings. Marrying princesses from other kingdoms was a way of sealing pacts of peace and cooperation. When Solomon married the daughter of a foreign king, it created an alliance between Israel and that kingdom. Both sides pledged not to attack each other, and often, these marriages brought economic benefits, such as commercial exchanges and mutual cooperation. One of the most notable examples of this practice was Solomon's marriage to the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, one of the greatest powers of the time. This alliance not only guaranteed peace between Israel and Egypt, but also strengthened trade connections between the two countries. These marriages also had a significant impact on Israel's economy. With strong alliances, trade routes between Israel and its neighbors expanded, bringing wealth to the kingdom. Israelite merchants had access to products and luxury goods from distant lands, such as spices, gold, silver, and fine wood. The cities of Israel flourished with trade, and Solomon's wealth became increasingly evident. However, there was a complicated side to this marriage policy. Solomon married many foreign women, and this began to bring spiritual challenges to the people of Israel. Many of these women worshiped different gods, according to the traditions of their own people. To maintain peace in his home and please his wives, Solomon allowed them to continue practicing their religions, building altars and temples to their gods within Israel. This decision was a watershed, as over time it led to the introduction of foreign cults into the kingdom, something that was deeply disapproved of by God. The Bible mentions that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, many of them from pagan nations. Although this ensured political stability during his reign, the presence of so many different religions began to weaken the people of Israel's devotion to the true God. Idol worship became a growing problem, and this had spiritual and political consequences over time. Even so, from a diplomatic point of view, Solomon's strategy worked for many years. The kingdom of Israel remained at peace with its neighbors, and Solomon avoided many conflicts that other kings might have faced. By marrying foreign princesses, he ensured that Israel was seen as a valuable ally and a stable nation strengthened by these connections. Solomon consolidated Israel's military and economic power, transforming Jerusalem into a thriving commercial center and a city admired by distant kingdoms. Imagine one of the most important moments in Solomon's alliance policy: his marriage to the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. This marriage was not only an event of great personal importance for Solomon, but also an extremely strategic political move, which had profound consequences for Israel and its relationships with other nations. At the time, Egypt was one of the largest and most powerful civilizations in the world. Ruled by pharaohs who were seen as gods, Egypt had influence and military power that many nations feared. On the other hand, Israel, under Solomon's reign, was also becoming a regional power, known for its prosperity, wisdom, and wealth. The marriage between Solomon and the Pharaoh's daughter was, therefore, a union of two great powers of the time, which sealed a crucial alliance for both sides. By marrying the Pharaoh's daughter, Solomon ensured that Israel would be at peace with Egypt, which was essential for the kingdom's stability. There would be no threat of war between the two nations, and the alliance brought considerable economic benefits. Egypt, with its vast resources and trade routes, was a valuable partner for Israel. Peace between Israel and Egypt allowed trade to flow freely, bringing luxury goods and precious materials to Solomon's kingdom. Furthermore, this alliance strengthened Israel's prestige among other nations, showing that Solomon was a king respected by rulers throughout the ancient world. But what do we know about the Egyptian princess, the Pharaoh's daughter? Although the Bible does not mention many details about her, we can imagine the cultural impact she brought by marrying Solomon and living in Jerusalem. Growing up in one of Egypt's most luxurious palaces, surrounded by rituals and traditions deeply rooted in Egyptian culture, she certainly brought a new set of influences to the kingdom of Israel. Her marriage to Solomon was a fusion of two powerful cultures: the monotheism of Israel and the polytheistic, ritual-filled world of Egypt. This marriage also marked an important transition in Solomon's life. From the moment he married the Pharaoh's daughter, he began to open up more to foreign cultures and their practices. As previously mentioned, Solomon's marriage policy ultimately allowed the introduction of pagan religions and practices into Israel, which would later cause spiritual problems for the kingdom. However, at the time of this marriage, the alliance with Egypt seemed to be one of the wisest and most strategic decisions Solomon could make. The reception of the Egyptian princess in Jerusalem would have been a grand event. Imagine the city streets full of curious people, admiring the majestic procession that accompanied the princess. She would have brought with her a caravan of servants, Egyptian treasures, and magnificent gifts for Solomon. The people's chants, the celebrations in the streets, everything symbolized the beginning of a new era of cooperation and peace between Israel and Egypt. However, this marriage was not only a celebration of personal union, but also a symbol of Solomon's diplomatic power. He showed the world that Israel was not only a prosperous nation, but also a political power that could trade on equal terms with Egypt, the giant of the south. In addition to peace and trade, marriage to the Pharaoh's daughter also brought a certain military security. By forming an alliance with Egypt, Solomon ensured that Israel would not need to worry about invasions or attacks from the south. This allowed him to focus his efforts on other aspects of the reign, such as the development of trade, infrastructure, and, of course, the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. Peace between Israel and Egypt lasted throughout Solomon's reign, and much of this stability can be attributed to this marriage alliance. Although Solomon's openness to foreign cultures and religions was later criticized, at this point in history his marriage to Pharaoh's daughter was a move that secured lasting peace for Israel and allowed the kingdom to prosper as never before. Thus, Solomon's marriage to the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt was not just a union between a man and a woman, but a strategic alliance that ensured peace, trade, and stability for two of the greatest powers of the time. It was a diplomatic move that marked Solomon's reign and ensured that Israel remained strong and prosperous during the years of his leadership. Naaman, an Egyptian princess who played a significant role in Solomon's life. His introduction into the royal palace of Jerusalem marked the beginning of a profound and transformative relationship, not only for Solomon, but also for the kingdom of Israel. The story begins during Solomon's diplomatic visit to Egypt. As part of his strategy to maintain alliances and ensure peace with neighboring nations, Solomon often maintained diplomatic contacts with powerful kingdoms, and Egypt, under the command of the pharaoh, was one of these powers. During this visit, he was introduced to Naaman, an Egyptian princess of rare beauty and intelligence, daughter of one of the highest dignitaries of the pharaonic court. Naaman was a woman unlike any other Solomon had ever met. Raised in the luxurious and sophisticated environment of the Egyptian palace, she had received an unusual education for the time. From a young age, she was instructed in the arts, science, and religion of Egypt. Her grace and intelligence were notorious, which made her a striking figure not only for her appearance, but for her ability to express herself and her deep understanding of life and politics. When Solomon met her, he was immediately impressed. It wasn't just her physical beauty that captivated him, but the way she carried herself, her confidence, and the way she understood the world around her. He realized that, in addition to a possible diplomatic alliance, Naaman could be a companion with whom he could share his responsibilities as ruler. And for someone like Solomon, who sought wisdom in all things, having a woman of intellect and vision at his side was an attractive prospect. As Naaman and Solomon got to know each other better, they began to develop a special bond. During the lavish parties and banquets held in Egypt, they would spend hours talking about governance, culture, and the complexities of royal life. For Solomon, these exchanges with Naaman were not just a pleasant distraction, but rather a meeting of minds. He felt he had finally found someone who could understand the challenges and pressures he faced as king. The decision to bring Naaman to the palace in Jerusalem was made quickly. For Solomon, it was clear that she would not be just another of his many wives, but a partner who would bring a new perspective and a genuine connection. Naaman, in turn, was also fascinated by Solomon. Even though she was raised in such a different context, she heard stories about Solomon's wisdom, which had spread to distant lands, including Egypt. Naaman's initial curiosity turned to admiration as she discovered more about the character and wisdom of the king of Israel. When Naaman arrived in Jerusalem, he was greeted with a grand reception. The city streets were full of curious people, eager to see the new princess who would now be part of Solomon's court. There was a celebratory atmosphere in the air, and Naaman, with his graceful posture and serene gaze, enchanted the people of Israel. His presence brought a new dimension to the royal palace, a blend of Egyptian and Israelite culture that would soon begin to shape life within Jerusalem's walls. Inside the palace, Naaman soon stood out. Her intelligence, combined with her ability to adapt, allowed her to gain the respect of Solomon's court and other wives. She became involved in the kingdom's affairs, offering advice and suggestions on diplomatic and political matters. Solomon, always seeking wisdom in all his decisions, valued Naaman's opinions and often consulted her on complex issues. Naaman was not just a companion for Solomon. She was a valuable advisor, someone who understood the game of international politics. Her education and experience at the Egyptian court made her a figure of great importance in Solomon's reign. Under his influence, the royal palace in Jerusalem began to reflect traits of Egyptian culture, from fashion to the arts, creating a fusion of two great civilizations. However, this union also brought challenges. The introduction of an Egyptian princess into the palace of Israel meant the entry of new traditions and beliefs, which did not go unnoticed by Israel's religious leaders. But at that moment, Solomon was delighted with the way Naaman enriched his life and his reign. Imagine for a moment the sun shining high in the Egyptian sky, reflecting its golden light on the banks of the Nile River. It was a different day, a day that would change Naaman's life forever. The Egyptian princess, raised in the heart of the pharaoh's luxurious palace, was preparing to leave everything she knew behind. The grand marble corridors, the statues of the Egyptian gods, the gentle murmur of the Nile waters. All of this would be just a memory. She was about to embark on an uncertain journey to Jerusalem, the land of King Solomon, where she would not only begin a new life, but also unite two great nations. With a heart full of expectation and a touch of longing, Naaman said goodbye to his family in a ceremony marked by pomp and tradition. The caravan that would accompany her was ready. Richly adorned, the royal entourage carried with them treasures from Egypt, gold, spices, fine fabrics, gifts for King Solomon, a sign of the greatness of his new alliance. The carriages were lined up, The camels were loaded, and the long journey began. The road to Jerusalem was a mix of stunning scenery and challenges. The desert seemed to have no end, and the nights were cold. But Naaman moved forward, always keeping his eyes on the horizon, imagining what his new life would be like next to the king of Israel. Egypt became increasingly distant, and with it, its old certainties. The future was unknown, but there was something about Solomon that made her believe that everything would work out. She knew that she was not only going to find a husband, but also a destiny that would unite two powerful nations. After weeks of travel, the walls of Jerusalem finally appeared in the distance. The holy city stood out against the blue sky, imposing and majestic. Naaman felt his heart quicken. Jerusalem was not like Egypt, but there was a special aura around it, a vibrant energy that pulsed through its streets. As she approached, she could see Solomon's temple, the one she had heard so much about, a magnificent structure that reflected the glory of God and the wisdom of her new husband. Upon entering the city, the reception was spectacular. The streets of Jerusalem were full of people eager to see the new queen. There were flowers scattered along the path, musicians playing festive melodies, and the people waved with joy and curiosity. Naaman, with his regal bearing and exotic beauty, enchanted the eyes of the Israelites. They had never seen anyone like her. The Pharaoh's daughter, from distant lands, was now part of their story. The procession continued to Solomon's palace, where a grand ceremony awaited. Solomon, known for his wisdom and justice, was waiting for her. When their eyes met, there was something more than a simple political union there. It was as if they both knew they were about to build something unique. The ceremony was a spectacle of grandeur. There were prayers, songs, and banquets, and before the entire kingdom, Naaman was presented as the new queen of Israel. But for Naaman, that moment was more than a title or a coronation. Alongside Solomon, she knew she was there for something greater, to represent the fusion of two powerful cultures. Egypt, with its rich history and traditions, now found a place alongside Israel, a kingdom chosen by God, and Naaman, with his intelligence and grace, was the bridge between these two worlds. She entered Solomon's palace, a place full of splendor and wealth, different from what she knew, but no less impressive. The spacious courtyards, lush gardens, and halls decorated with gold and finely carved wood left Naaman in awe. But at the same time, she knew that her journey didn't end there. She would have to adapt to a new culture, learn new customs, and, at the same time, bring with her the essence of her own Egyptian heritage. Naaman's arrival in Jerusalem was just the beginning of a new phase in her life, a phase full of challenges that she could never have anticipated. After the warm welcome and celebrations that marked her triumphant entry into the city, she soon realized that her true journey was just beginning. Jerusalem was completely different from Egypt, both in appearance and in soul. Naaman, who grew up in the heart of Egypt, was accustomed to the grandeur of the pyramids, the temples dedicated to many gods, and the complex and fascinating rituals that were part of everyday life. She had been raised to believe in a multitude of gods, each responsible for an aspect of life, from fertility to war, from love to death. It was a culture rich in symbols, with a spirituality deeply linked to nature and the cycles of life. But in Jerusalem, things were different. The people of Israel had only one God, an invisible God, without statues, without images, who did not mix with the physical world. To Naaman, this was a strange, almost incomprehensible concept. How could a single God govern all things? How could this God be so distant and, at the same time, so present in their lives? Soon after settling in Solomon's palace, Naaman began to realize the weight of this difference. In the streets of Jerusalem, there were no altars to different deities, as in Egypt. Instead, everything revolved around the temple, the holy place dedicated to the God of Israel. The priests spoke of Yahweh's greatness, and the people offered their prayers with a reverence that Naaman had never seen before. Monotheism was something completely new to her. In the privacy of the palace, Naaman had to face this change in a very personal way. Solomon, who deeply loved and respected her, also knew that his new queen would need time to understand and accept this new spiritual reality. He did not force her to immediately abandon her beliefs, but encouraged her to observe and learn, offering her the opportunity to participate in Israelite rituals and festivities, so that she could gradually learn about the faith of the people of Israel. Naaman, however, felt torn. Love and respect for Solomon motivated her to try to understand this invisible God, but memories of her Egyptian traditions still followed her. At night, she sometimes dreamed of the temples of her home, of the rituals in honor of Isis, Osiris, and Ra. Nostalgia hit hard, and Naaman found himself at a crossroads. Accepting this new path his life was taking, or trying to keep his old faith alive, even if in secret. Over time, however, something inside Naaman began to change. As she participated in the celebrations at Solomon's temple, as she listened to the stories of Moses and the prophets, she began to feel something different. There was a depth to the Israelites' faith that touched her in a way she hadn't expected. The worship of Yahweh, despite being a practice without images and ornaments, had a purity and spiritual connection that Naaman began to admire. Still, the adaptation was not easy. Appointed as queen, Naaman knew that she was closely watched, not only by the court, but also by the people. She had to find a balance between honoring her roots and respecting the traditions of her new home. She began to study the sacred texts of Israel, talk to the priests, and seek to understand more about the God of her husband and his new people. In the palace, Naaman also brought some Egyptian culture into his daily life. Her clothes still bore the refined features of her homeland, and she commissioned fabrics and jewelry that recalled the style of her youth. However, she knew that the transformation was inevitable. Every day, Jerusalem became less strange, and what was once unknown was now becoming part of who she was becoming. Naaman realized that more than a cultural or religious adaptation, this journey was an internal transformation. It was not just a matter of abandoning old gods or adopting new customs, but of finding his place in a world where his heart could dwell between two kingdoms, the Egypt of his birth and the Israel of his destiny. Over time, Naaman began to participate more frequently in Israelite festivities and rituals, and although her heart still held memories of Egypt, she began to see that faith in Yahweh was not just about obedience to a single God, but about a relationship of trust, love, and reverence that transcended any belief she had known before. Thus, Naaman little by little found a new identity. She did not completely leave her roots behind, but she knew how to welcome her new life in Jerusalem with wisdom. In the process of adaptation, she discovered that, by combining her Egyptian experiences with the lessons learned in Israel, she became a bridge between two worlds, a queen capable of bringing peace between the past and the present, between two great nations, and, most importantly, between the old and new faith in her own soul. Over the years, Naaman's presence in Israel was no longer seen solely as that of a foreign queen. She came to occupy a central position in Solomon's court, influencing the kingdom in subtle but significant ways. From the beginning, it was clear that Naaman was no ordinary princess. His charm, intelligence, and deep knowledge of Egyptian culture began to shape the atmosphere of the Jerusalem palace. Her influence grew not only as the king's wife, but as a true advisor. When settling in the palace, Naaman brought with him elements of his homeland. Solomon's palace, already magnificent in itself, began to take on exotic features, a fusion between Israel and Egypt. Their costumes, made of fine linen and adorned with intricate details that reflected the luxury of the pharaonic court, soon came to be imitated by the women of the court. Little by little, Egyptian influences appeared in the clothes and ornaments of Jerusalem. But it wasn't just in fashion that Naaman left his mark. Egyptian art, with its geometric and symbolic forms, found space in tapestries, mosaics, and even in the architecture of gardens and palace interiors. Solomon, always open to new ideas, saw these changes as an opportunity to further enrich his kingdom, transforming Jerusalem into a cultural center where different traditions blended in harmony. However, Naaman's influence went beyond aesthetics. With her diplomatic training acquired at the Egyptian court, she was accustomed to the complexities of international politics. His experience helped Solomon deal with delicate negotiations and strategic alliances. As their relationship deepened, Solomon increasingly relied on his vision to maintain the kingdom's stability. On many occasions, when Solomon faced difficult negotiations with other nations, he turned to Naaman for advice. She helped him interpret the intentions of foreign rulers and find diplomatic solutions to avoid conflicts. Naaman understood that peace and trade were fundamental to Israel's success, and he used his experience to ensure that the kingdom prospered without resorting to war. A clear example of his influence was in negotiations with Tyre, one of the largest commercial centers at the time. Under Naaman's guidance, Solomon strengthened his alliance with Hiram, king of Tyre, which brought lasting commercial and political benefits. Naaman knew foreign customs well and knew how to guide Solomon to act strategically to consolidate these ties. Inside the palace, Naaman also had an active role in everyday decisions. Although Solomon was Israel's wisest king, even he needed someone to share his concerns with. Naaman became that person. In long conversations, they discussed the future of Israel, the challenges the kingdom faced, and the best ways to maintain peace and prosperity. His role at court helped strengthen his position among Solomon's many wives and concubines. Even with so many women in the palace, few enjoyed the level of respect and influence that Naaman had. It was not only her origins as an Egyptian princess that made her stand out, but also her intelligence and ability to make decisions. She was admired not only for her beauty, but for her ability to navigate the political complexities of the court with dexterity. As the years passed, Naaman's influence over Solomon and the kingdom of Israel consolidated. Under his guidance, the royal palace became a true meeting point of cultures, where traditions from different parts of the ancient world mixed. Naaman, throughout her life, proved to be much more than a foreign princess. She became a fundamental figure in the construction of Solomon's legacy, helping to shape not only the court, but the destiny of the entire kingdom. However, as Solomon's reign progressed, what had once appeared to be a successful policy began to reveal unexpected challenges. Although Solomon was known for his wisdom and diplomatic alliances, the fact that he married so many women from foreign lands, including Naaman, brought complications to the kingdom. Initially, these alliances seemed to guarantee peace and stability, but over time, their consequences began to emerge. Each of these wives brought with them their own religious traditions. While the people of Israel faithfully followed monotheism, worshiping Yahweh, these women maintained their beliefs in the gods of their lands. Naaman, for example, grew up in Egypt, where the worship of gods like Isis and Osiris was part of everyday life. Other wives of Solomon worshiped Baal, Ashtoreth, and Molech. To please them, Solomon allowed them to build altars and temples for these gods, spreading them throughout Israel. The kingdom of Israel, which had always been based on the exclusive worship of Yahweh, began to see signs of religious syncretism. The increase in altars and shrines to foreign gods became increasingly visible, challenging the people's religious identity. Solomon's temple, which was a symbol of the covenant with God, now shared space with cults dedicated to other gods. Solomon believed he was in control of the situation. For him, these gestures were necessary to maintain harmony in the kingdom and within his own home. He loved his wives, and this love led him to be tolerant of their religious practices. However, as these influences grew, the hearts of the people of Israel were divided. Ancient traditions and faith in Yahweh began to be questioned. This religious mix created deep tensions in the kingdom. On the one hand, religious leaders warned about the dangers of these practices, fearing that monotheism, the essence of the people of Israel, would be weakened. On the other hand, the growing influence of foreign cultures at court began to shape Israel's public life. Festivities and sacrifices to other gods became common, confusing the people who looked to Solomon for direction. Naaman, one of Solomon's favorite wives, also played a role in this scenario. Although her presence enriched the kingdom culturally, she, like other foreign wives, brought with her religious traditions that challenged Israel's monotheism. The atmosphere of religious confusion grew within the palace itself. Over time, the wisdom that had always guided Solomon began to cloud. Influenced by his many alliances and affections, he turned away from exclusive devotion to Yahweh. The heart that once asked God for wisdom was divided, and Israel's spiritual harmony began to disintegrate. In Solomon's old age, the Bible reports that he turned away from God, influenced by his wives and the foreign practices he allowed in his kingdom. Although he was still a respected ruler, Israel's soul was in decline. Religious syncretism had eroded the spiritual unity that had always sustained the nation, and what began as an act of love and diplomacy ended up compromising the future of the kingdom. After 40 years of reign, Solomon died. His reign, marked by glory and prosperity, now left behind a divided kingdom. Solomon's heart, once completely devoted to God, had gone astray, and the impact of his decisions began to blossom into chaos. With Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam inherited a kingdom that, although it still seemed grand, was deeply weakened. The people, tired of heavy taxes and religious tensions, demanded changes. When Rehoboam refused to ease the people's burden, the northern tribes rebelled, dividing Israel into two kingdoms: Israel in the north under Jeroboam, and Judah in the south under Rehoboam. This division was devastating. The unity that David and Solomon had built fell apart, and the period of peace and prosperity that Israel had known came to an end. The two kingdoms began to live in constant tension, weakened politically and spiritually. Over the years, foreign powers took advantage of this weakness, culminating in the destruction of Israel and Judah. Thus Solomon's reign, which began with promises of glory, ended in division and decline. Your wisdom and power have been compromised by your choices, and the lesson that remains is clear. Power and wisdom, without faithfulness to God, cannot sustain a kingdom.